A frozen bone lies in the soil of southern Germany, untouched for 40,000 years. When scientists extract DNA from this ancient fragment in 2022, they discover something impossible. A genetic signature unlike anything expected, challenging everything we thought we knew about European ancestry. The ancient individual carried genetic markers that should not exist in Central Europe during this time period. More bewildering still, these exact markers would reappear in medieval German royal bloodlines thousands of years later, as if some biological time capsule had been preserved, then reopened. How could genetic material vanish from an entire population, only to resurface millennia later in the same geographic region? This mystery, what geneticists now call the German DNA paradox, represents one of the most perplexing puzzles in modern archaeology and population genetics. What you are about to discover is not merely a story about ancestry. It is a scientific detective story where the clues span 40,000 years, from mammoth hunters to medieval monarchs. It reveals how cutting-edge technology is rewriting our understanding of European history and challenging fundamental assumptions about human migration and adaptation. Most importantly, it demonstrates how our bodies carry historical records more detailed and accurate than any written text, if only we know how to read them. The implications reach beyond Germany and beyond Europe. They touch on fundamental questions about who we are, where we come from, and how our ancestry shapes our present in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. The German genetic mystery stands at the intersection of archaeology, history, climatology, and molecular biology. A true scientific crossroads where old certainties dissolve and new understandings emerge. Let us begin with a simple question. What makes German DNA so uniquely mysterious among European populations? And why has this mystery remained hidden until now? Dr. Stefan Ihrig adjusted his glasses as the DNA sequencing results appeared on his computer screen. Outside his lab at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, rain pattered against the windows. The skeletal remains on his laboratory table, recovered from a cave in Bavaria, had been dated to approximately 37,000 BCE, during the Upper Paleolithic period when anatomically modern humans coexisted with Neanderthals in Europe. "This cannot be right," he muttered, running the analysis again. The genetic markers he was seeing should not be present in Central Europe during this time period. According to all established migration models, these specific genetic variants were associated with populations from the Pontic steppe region that would not arrive in Germany until the Bronze Age, roughly 30,000 years later. Yet here they were, in a bone that predated their expected arrival by millennia. Stefan had stumbled upon what would become known as the Bayerlein anomaly, named after the cave where the remains were found. This single discovery would eventually upend decades of scientific consensus about how and when different populations arrived in Central Europe. The traditional narrative of European genetic history had seemed straightforward enough. Hunter-gatherers first arrived from Africa around 45,000 years ago, followed by farmers from the Near East beginning around 8000 BCE. Then, around 4500 BCE, pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region brought new genetic lineages, technologies, and Indo-European languages to the continent. This three-wave model explained the general genetic makeup of most Europeans. But the Bayerlein remains contained genetic markers that belonged to none of these established waves. Instead, they displayed a unique genetic signature that would later become characteristic of certain medieval German royal families. A signature that had seemingly vanished from the general population for tens of thousands of years. How could this be possible? Had a distinct population existed in prehistoric Germany, disappeared, and then somehow re-emerged in the royal bloodlines of the Middle Ages? Or was there some error in the dating, the DNA analysis, or the archaeological context? To understand why this discovery was so revolutionary, we must first understand what makes German genetic heritage distinct from other European populations in the first place. Germany occupies a geographic crossroads in Europe, bordered by the North Sea and Baltic in the north, the Alps in the south, the Rhine in the west, and the Carpathians to the east. This central position made German territories a unique mixing ground for numerous migrations, invasions, and cultural exchanges throughout prehistoric and historic times. While many people imagine European populations as relatively stable over time, genetic research has revealed that the continent experienced multiple major population turnovers. These did not merely add new genetic lineages to the existing pool. They often replaced previous populations almost entirely. When we look at the genetic makeup of contemporary Germans, explained Dr. Faith Mitchell, a paleogeneticist at the University of Tübingen, we are seeing the result of at least 5 major genetic shifts, not the 3 that were previously assumed. And several of these shifts occurred only in the region we now call Germany, making its genetic history distinctly different from neighboring areas like France, Poland, or Scandinavia. The first of these unique transitions occurred during the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets covered much of northern Europe. While populations in Spain, Italy, and the Balkans remained relatively stable in their southern refuges, the inhabitants of Central Europe either died out or retreated. When the ice receded, the recolonization of Germany came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a genetic complexity not seen in regions with more straightforward recolonization patterns. Germany is essentially a palimpsest, Faith continued, using the term for a manuscript where older writing has been erased to make room for new text. But in this case, traces of the older genetic writing remain visible if you know where to look. This brings us back to the Bayerlein discovery. What Stefan Ihrig found in that ancient DNA sample was what appeared to be a genetic ghost. Markers from a population that should have been erased from the palimpsest, yet somehow persisted, hidden from view until modern sequencing technology could detect it. The questions multiplied. Who were these ancient people? What happened to them? And how did their genetic signature reappear in medieval German royalty after disappearing from the general population for thousands of years? To find answers, Stefan needed more samples, more data, and more colleagues willing to challenge established theories. Little did he know that his discovery would lead to a complete reimagining of European prehistory, and reveal that German DNA harbored the most profound mysteries on the continent. The team assembled by Stefan Ihrig to investigate the Bayerlein anomaly included archaeologists, linguists, climatologists, and molecular biologists from 12 countries. They began by verifying the original finding through multiple independent analyses, confirming that the unusual genetic signature was real and not the result of contamination or laboratory error. Their next step was to search for similar genetic patterns in other ancient remains from across Europe. Over the next 3 years, they analyzed 712 ancient DNA samples spanning from the Upper Paleolithic to the early medieval period. The results were astonishing. The genetic signature first identified in the Bayerlein remains, what scientists now call the Bayerlein component, appeared in 7% of hunter-gatherer samples from southern Germany dating between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago. Then it vanished completely from the archaeological record for nearly 25,000 years before reappearing in small frequencies, 1 to 3%, in Bronze Age samples from Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg around 4000 BCE. Most remarkably, the frequency of this genetic component increased dramatically in samples associated with German nobility from the 8th century CE onward, reaching levels of 15 to 20% in some royal lineages by the 13th century. It was as if this genetic signature had been preserved in some isolated population for millennia, largely invisible to us, before suddenly becoming concentrated in the aristocratic bloodlines, explained Dr. Felix Neustadt, an archaeogeneticist who joined Stefan's team. Nothing like this had ever been documented before. The implications were profound. The traditional view of European genetics as the result of 3 major migrations needed to be reconsidered. There appeared to be at least one more significant population that had contributed to the genetic makeup of Central Europe, a population that had somehow maintained genetic distinctiveness despite major demographic upheavals. To better understand this mysterious component, the team needed to determine its origin. By comparing the Bayerlein genetic signature with thousands of ancient and modern DNA samples from across Eurasia, they made another startling discovery. The closest matches came from the Altai region of Central Asia. This suggested a previously unknown migration from Asia into Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, predating all other documented population movements. But if these early migrants had been substantial enough to leave a genetic signature that persisted for millennia, why had archaeological evidence of their presence been so scarce? The answer may lie in the climatic catastrophe that struck Europe approximately 33,000 years ago, the Campanian ignimbrite eruption. This massive volcanic event in what is now Italy created a volcanic winter that devastated populations across Europe, potentially causing the extinction of many distinct genetic lineages. We believe the original population carrying the byerline component was largely wiped out during this period, said Dr. Sarah Kleinschmidt, a paleoclimatologist working with the team. But small groups may have survived in isolated refugia, perhaps in alpine valleys or other protected environments where they could maintain their genetic distinctiveness. These surviving groups would have been too small to leave a significant archaeological footprint, explaining why material evidence of their existence has been so elusive. As climate conditions improved, they would have gradually reintegrated with surrounding populations, diluting their genetic signature in the general population but preserving certain distinctive markers. But this still did not explain how these genetic markers became concentrated in medieval German royalty thousands of years later. To solve this part of the puzzle, the team turned to medieval historical records and more recent genetic samples. They discovered that several noble families from a specific region in southern Bavaria showed unusually high levels of the byerline component. Historical documents indicated that these families claimed descent from an ancient line they called the Altest, or most ancient ones, who were said to possess special knowledge and abilities. While medieval claims of special ancestry are common among nobility, genetic analysis showed these particular families truly did carry an unusual genetic heritage. More intriguingly, this genetic signature was associated with several distinctive physical traits, including a specific craniofacial structure, unusual tooth morphology, and a higher-than-average incidence of certain congenital conditions. We believe there was likely some form of assortative mating occurring among these lineages, explained Dr. Mitchell. Perhaps these physical characteristics were seen as markers of ancient and prestigious bloodlines, leading to preferential marriage alliances between families carrying these traits. In essence, what began as a random survival of ancient genetic lineages may have been transformed into a deliberately cultivated trait among certain elite groups during the medieval period, a biological marker of claimed ancient authority and right to rule. The full implications of the byerline discovery were still unfolding, but one thing was clear. The genetic history of Europe, and particularly Germany, was far more complex than anyone had previously imagined. Ancient populations had not simply been replaced wholesale by successive waves of migration. Rather, complex patterns of survival, admixture, isolation, and reintegration had created a genetic landscape of remarkable intricacy. And somewhere within this complexity lay hidden the story of a mysterious ancient people whose genetic legacy had quietly persisted for 40,000 years, occasionally emerging into historical visibility before disappearing again into the shadows of time. The discovery of the byerline component raised as many questions as it answered. If this genetic signature originated in Central Asia, how and why did these ancient migrants travel thousands of kilometers to what is now Germany? What were their cultural contributions? And perhaps most intriguingly, did they leave any impact on European mythology, language, or belief systems that might have persisted alongside their genetic legacy? To explore these questions, Stefan Ehrig's team expanded to include experts in linguistics, folklore, and comparative mythology. Their investigations revealed surprising connections that had previously gone unnoticed. Dr. Frida Morrison, a historical linguist specializing in Indo-European languages, identified a small subset of words in certain German dialects that appeared to have no clear Indo-European origin. These words, primarily related to landscape features, certain plants, and ritual concepts, showed phonological patterns more consistent with Siberian language families. These linguistic fossils suggest that the byerline people may have contributed not just genes, but also cultural concepts to prehistoric Central Europe, Frida explained. The most interesting examples relate to sacred geography, terms for specific types of mountains, caves, and springs that were considered spiritually significant. Meanwhile, archaeological re-examination of Upper Paleolithic sites in southern Germany revealed subtle but distinctive differences in tool-making techniques at sites where byerline DNA had been recovered. These included a unique method of pressure-flaking stone tools and distinctive decorative patterns on carved bone items that showed similarities to artifacts from the Altai region. We're seeing technological signatures that distinguish these people from other European hunter-gatherers of the same period, noted Dr. Marcus Hollenberg, an archaeologist from the University of Cologne. They appear to have maintained certain traditional practices, even while adapting to European environments. But perhaps the most fascinating connections emerged in the realm of mythology. Several folk traditions preserved in alpine regions of southern Germany and Austria contain stories of an ancient race called the Venediger Mannlein or Venetian little men, who were said to possess extraordinary knowledge of minerals, metals, and medicine. While these legends had previously been interpreted as references to medieval Italian traders, the geographic distribution of these tales corresponded remarkably well with areas where the Bayerlein genetic component showed higher frequencies in medieval samples. Furthermore, the described physical characteristics of these mythical beings, including distinctive facial features and unusual teeth, matched the phenotypic traits associated with the Bayerlein genetic markers. We're seeing what appears to be the transformation of a biological reality into folklore, explained cultural anthropologist Dr. Helen Vaughan. As these ancient lineages became increasingly rare, their distinctive appearance and preserved traditional knowledge may have taken on a mythical quality in popular imagination. This connection between genetics and folklore opened a new avenue for understanding European mythology. Other legendary beings, from dwarves to elves to various ancient races, described in folklore across the continent, might similarly represent cultural memories of distinct populations that once existed alongside the dominant groups. The genetic evidence also shed new light on the migration history of the Bayerlein population. By analyzing the specific mutation patterns and comparing them with other ancient DNA samples from across Eurasia, the team was able to reconstruct a probable migration route from the Altai region through the Central Asian steppes, around the northern shores of the Black Sea, and into Central Europe. This journey would have occurred approximately 45,000 years ago, making it one of the earliest known migrations of anatomically modern humans into Europe. The timing coincided with a period of relatively mild climate conditions that would have made such a long-distance migration more feasible. But what drove these ancient people to travel so far from their homeland? Here, climate records provided critical insights. Ice core and pollen data indicated that Central Asia experienced a period of extreme aridity around 47,000 to 46,000 years ago, which would have severely stressed hunter-gatherer populations in the region. It appears these people were essentially climate refugees, explained Dr. Kleinschmidt. They were likely following animal herds westward as their traditional territories became uninhabitable, eventually finding themselves in an entirely new environment thousands of kilometers from their origin point. Once in Europe, these migrants would have encountered Neanderthal populations already present in the region. Genetic analysis showed that the Bayerlein people had levels of Neanderthal DNA approximately 0.8% higher than other early European human populations, suggesting they may have interbred more extensively with Neanderthals than other groups. This higher level of Neanderthal admixture might partially explain why the Bayerlein component includes several adaptive genetic variants not seen in other European populations, noted Dr. Mitchell. These include genes related to immune function, fat metabolism, and adaptation to cold environments. These adaptive advantages may have helped the Bayerlein people survive in Europe through the harsh climatic conditions of the Upper Paleolithic. They also raise the possibility that what began as a desperate migration ultimately provided genetic advantages that would be preserved through natural selection for tens of thousands of years. As the team pieced together this ancient migration story, another mystery emerged. The genetic data showed that the Bayerlein component had persisted at low levels in the general population throughout the Neolithic and Bronze Age, but became significantly more concentrated in certain lineages during the migration period, approximately 400 to 800 CE, when Germanic tribes were establishing new kingdoms across Europe. This suggested that something during this turbulent historical period had created conditions where these ancient genetic markers became advantageous or prestigious once again. To understand this phenomenon, the researchers turned their attention to the complex interactions between genetics, social structure, and political power during the formation of early medieval German states. What they would discover would reveal how ancient DNA could influence not just biology, but the very structure of human societies, and how the ghosts of the distant past could shape the course of recorded history. The migration period, that chaotic era when the Roman Empire collapsed and new kingdoms emerged across Europe, represents one of the most significant political and cultural transformations in European history. During this time, various Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, Angles, Saxons, and others, established new political entities that would eventually develop into modern European nations. Traditional historical accounts of this period focus on military conquests, religious conversions, and the emergence of new legal and political institutions. But Stefan Ehrig's team discovered that genetics played a previously unrecognized role in this transformative era. By analyzing ancient DNA samples from burial sites associated with Germanic tribal elites, they found that certain ruling lineages showed significantly elevated levels of the Bayerline genetic component, far higher than in the general population they governed. What we're seeing is a form of genetic stratification that coincides with social hierarchy, explained Dr. Samuel Turner, a historical sociologist who joined the research team. The Bayerline component appears at frequencies of 12 to 18% in samples from aristocratic burials, but remains below 3% in contemporaneous commoner graves from the same regions. This pattern was particularly pronounced among the Bavariae tribe in southern Germany and certain branches of the Alemannic and Frankish nobility. Historical texts from this period provided clues to understanding why these genetic markers became concentrated in ruling lineages. Several early medieval chronicles refer to certain noble families possessing ancient blood, or being descended from the old race. These families were described as having distinctive physical characteristics, particularly unusual facial structures, distinctive eye colors, and exceptional height that marked them as special or chosen. In early Germanic society, leadership was based on a combination of military prowess, personal charisma, and claimed divine ancestry, Dr. Turner explained. Physical traits associated with the Bayerline component may have been interpreted as visible signs of ancient and prestigious bloodlines, giving their bearers additional legitimacy as rulers. This process created a feedback loop. Individuals with these genetic markers were more likely to achieve high status, which gave them greater reproductive opportunities and resources to support larger families. Their children, carrying the same genetic markers, would benefit from their parents' status and be preferred as marriage partners by other elite families. It's essentially a process of genetic social climbing, noted Dr. Mitchell. What began as random genetic variation became socially significant, which then drove further genetic concentration within certain social strata. This phenomenon was not limited to Germany. As Germanic tribes expanded across Europe during the migration period, they carried these genetic markers with them. Analysis of elite burials in Italy, France, England, and Spain revealed that ruling families in these regions also showed elevated levels of the Bayerline component, though at lower frequencies than in Germany itself. The most extreme concentration occurred in the Carolingian dynasty, which united much of Western Europe under Charlemagne in the early 9th century. Genetic samples recovered from remains attributed to Charlemagne's direct ancestors showed Bayerline component frequencies approaching 25%, among the highest detected in any medieval samples. This genetic connection may help explain certain aspects of Carolingian political ideology. Charlemagne's imperial project explicitly referenced ancient Rome, but it also contained elements suggesting connection to an even more ancient authority. The Carolingians promoted legends tracing their ancestry not just to Frankish tribal leaders but to mythical ancient kings who supposedly ruled before the coming of the Romans. These origin myths weren't simply political propaganda, argued Dr. Vaughan. They may have represented preserved cultural memories of actual biological connections to ancient populations, memories reinforced by visible physical traits that distinguished the ruling elite. The concentration of Bayerline genetics in medieval German royalty reached its peak during the Ottonian dynasty, 10th to 11th centuries, which established the Holy Roman Empire. Otto I and his descendants showed the highest frequencies of these genetic markers ever recorded, approaching 30% in some individuals. This genetic distinction manifested physically in what contemporary chronicles described as the Ottonian visage, a distinctive facial structure featuring prominent cheekbones, unusually shaped eye orbits, and a characteristic jawline. These traits became so associated with imperial authority that they were emphasized in royal portraiture, with artists exaggerating these features to emphasize the emperor's special status. What's remarkable is how a genetic signature from 40,000 years ago became transformed into a visual symbol of political legitimacy, noted Dr. Turner. Biology became ideology, with random genetic variants taking on profound social significance. But this concentration of ancient genetics in royal lineages also had medical consequences. The byreline component included several genetic variants associated with distinctive health profiles, both advantages and disadvantages. These included genes linked to enhanced cold tolerance and immune function, but also increased risk for certain neurological conditions. Historical records indicate that several medieval German rulers exhibited symptoms consistent with these genetic conditions. Otto III was described as suffering from fits of the ancient melancholy that match descriptions of a neurological disorder associated with one of the byreline genetic variants. Conrad II was noted for his extraordinary tolerance for cold, allegedly bathing in ice water and wearing light clothing in winter, behaviors consistent with the cold adaptation genes in the byreline component. These rulers weren't just politically distinct from the populations they governed. They were biologically distinct in ways that affected their behavior, health, and possibly their approach to leadership, explained Dr. Mitchell. The concentration of these genetic markers in royal lineages began to decline in the late medieval period, coinciding with changing patterns of royal marriage. As European monarchies developed more international marriage strategies, German royalty increasingly married into foreign royal families that did not carry the byreline component. By the 15th century, levels had decreased significantly in most noble families. However, certain branches of German aristocracy continued to show elevated frequencies into the early modern period. The Württemberg, Wittelsbach, and Habsburg families maintained higher than average levels of these genetic markers until the 18th century, possibly due to their tendency toward consanguineous marriages that concentrated existing genetic traits. The final decline of the byreline component in European royalty coincided with the gradual diminishment of aristocratic political power following the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. As hereditary rule gave way to constitutional governance, the genetic distinctiveness that had once helped legitimize royal authority lost its social and political significance. Yet even as these ancient genetic markers faded from Europe's royal courts, they continued to persist at low levels in the general population, silent witnesses to a 40,000-year journey from the Altai Mountains to the palaces of medieval Europe and beyond. The disappearance of the byreline component from royal lineages did not mean it vanished entirely. Modern genetic studies of European populations reveal that these ancient markers persist today, though in patterns that tell new stories about European history. Contemporary Germans carry the byreline component at an average frequency of approximately 2.3%, with significant regional variation. Southern Bavaria shows the highest contemporary concentrations, 4 to 5%, while northern German regions show the lowest, 0.5 to 1%. This distribution largely reflects the historical patterns identified in medieval samples, suggesting remarkable genetic continuity within specific geographic regions despite centuries of migration and population mixing. What makes these findings particularly remarkable is that they challenge the traditional view of Germany as a region of substantial genetic homogeneity. The persistence of the byreline component at varying frequencies across different regions reveals that the country remains a genetic mosaic shaped by ancient population movements and social structures. When we map the distribution of the byreline component across modern Germany, we're essentially looking at a genetic palimpsest that preserves population patterns established thousands of years ago, explained Stefan Ihrig. These patterns have persisted despite the massive population disruptions of the 30 Years' War, the World Wars, and modern migration. But perhaps the most unexpected discovery came when the team analyzed the byreline component's distribution outside of Germany. They found small but significant frequencies in unexpected places, including among certain populations in northern Spain, Scotland, Romania, and, most surprisingly, among the Sami people of northern Scandinavia. This peculiar distribution could not be explained by medieval Germanic expansions alone. Instead, it pointed to much earlier population movements that had previously gone undetected using traditional archaeological and historical methods. The Sami connection was particularly revelatory, noted Dr. Morrison. Linguistic analysis had previously suggested some ancient connections between Sami languages and Siberian language families, but the genetic evidence provides concrete support for ancient contacts that might have occurred 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, long before the Germanic tribes emerged. These discoveries demonstrated how ancient DNA could reveal historical connections invisible to traditional historical methods. They also showed how certain genetic signatures could persist over vast time periods even when cultural and linguistic evidence of these connections had been lost. But the implications of the byline discovery extended beyond historical curiosity. The research team identified several medically relevant genetic variants within the byline component that influenced risk profiles for certain conditions in modern populations. These included protective variants that reduced susceptibility to certain respiratory infections, an adaptation likely developed during the harsh conditions of the Upper Paleolithic, as well as variants affecting metabolism, circadian rhythms, and neurological function. Some of these variants had been identified in previous medical genetic studies but had been mistakenly classified as recent mutations rather than ancient adaptations. Understanding the true age and origin of these genetic variants changes how we interpret their medical significance, explained Dr. Mitchell. What we thought were random mutations may actually be adaptive traits selected for specific environmental conditions tens of thousands of years ago. This realization prompted medical researchers to reevaluate genetic variants associated with several conditions prevalent in Central European populations, including certain autoimmune disorders, metabolic conditions, and neurological traits. In some cases, what had been classified as genetic disorders appeared to be modern manifestations of ancient adaptations that had become disadvantageous in contemporary environments. For example, one variant associated with the byline component affects fat metabolism in ways that would have been advantageous during periods of food scarcity, but contributes to metabolic disorders in modern conditions of food abundance. Another influences sleep patterns in ways that would optimize functioning during the extreme seasonal light variations of northern latitudes, but can contribute to circadian disruptions in modern environments. These findings remind us that our genomes were shaped for environments very different from those we live in today, noted Dr. Mitchell. What was once adaptive can become maladaptive when environments change dramatically. Beyond the medical implications, the byline discovery sparked new approaches to studying other ghost populations, whose genetic signatures might be hidden within modern human genomes. Researchers began developing new computational methods specifically designed to detect ancient genetic components that persisted at low frequencies or had been concentrated in specific social groups. These methods soon yielded results in other regions. A similar phenomenon was identified in Japan, where genetic markers from the ancient Jomon population had become concentrated in certain aristocratic lineages during the Heian period. In Peru, genetic signatures from pre-Inca populations showed elevated frequencies in colonial-era noble families claiming descent from ancient kings. We're beginning to realize that the social stratification of ancient genetic components may be a widespread phenomenon in human societies, explained Dr. Turner. Political power, social prestige, and biological ancestry have been intertwined in complex ways throughout human history. This understanding challenged simplified narratives of human population history that treated entire regions as genetically homogeneous units. Instead, it revealed that within any population, different genetic components might be distributed unevenly based on geography, social class, family traditions, and cultural practices. The German case was particularly instructive because it demonstrated how a genetic component could persist for tens of thousands of years while waxing and waning in social significance. The same genetic markers that had once been randomly distributed among hunter-gatherer bands became concentrated in royal lineages during one historical period, then diffused back into the general population as social structures changed. Human genetic history isn't simply a story of populations replacing or mixing with each other, Stefan explained. It's also a story of how genetic variation becomes meaningful within societies, how random biological differences can be transformed into markers of identity, status, or difference. This social dimension of genetic history opened new dialogues between geneticists, historians, and social scientists. Rather than treating genetics as a deterministic force shaping human societies, researchers began exploring how social structures influenced the distribution and significance of genetic variation over time. The story of the byline component demonstrated that even after 40,000 years, the biological legacy of a small band of migrants from Central Asia continued to influence the genetic landscape of modern Europe. It showed how political power, social prestige, cultural memory, and biological inheritance had interacted in complex ways throughout European history. Most importantly, it revealed that the human genetic story was far more complex, nuanced, and multidimensional than previously imagined. Beneath the broad patterns of major population movements lay intricate histories of persistence, resilience, adaptation, and transformation that were only now becoming visible through the lens of ancient DNA. As the scientific investigation of the Bayerline component progressed, it inevitably attracted public attention. News of ancient royal DNA and mysterious prehistoric origins sparked imagination and speculation that sometimes raced ahead of the evidence. Various groups attempted to claim or reinterpret the findings for their own purposes, from harmless ancestry enthusiasts to more concerning ethno-nationalist movements. Recognizing the potential for misuse of their discoveries, Stefan Ehrig's team took proactive steps to contextualize their findings and communicate the scientific implications accurately. They emphasized several key points in their public communications. First, the Bayerline component represented only a small fraction of German genetic ancestry, typically 2 to 3% in modern populations. It was one thread in a complex tapestry of genetic heritage that included contributions from many different populations over thousands of years. Second, this genetic component was not unique to Germans or even to Europeans. Related genetic signatures appeared in populations across Eurasia, reflecting ancient connections that transcended modern national boundaries. Third, the concentration of these genetic markers in medieval nobility reflected social processes rather than inherent superiority. The same random genetic variants that had been associated with royal status in one historical period had been irrelevant to social status in earlier and later periods. What makes the Bayerline story scientifically significant isn't that it identifies some unique German essence, Stefan explained in a widely circulated public statement. It's valuable precisely because it shows how complex, interconnected, and dynamic human genetic history really is. It challenges simplistic narratives about pure or distinct populations by revealing 40,000 years of human movement, mixture, and social change. To further counter misinterpretations, the research team partnered with museums, educators, and media producers to create accessible materials explaining the significance of their findings. These efforts included a traveling exhibition titled 40,000 Years of Connection that used the Bayerline discovery to illustrate the shared genetic heritage of Eurasian populations. These educational initiatives had an unexpected effect. They sparked broader public interest in population genetics and its relationship to history, archaeology, and identity. People began to appreciate how ancient DNA research was revolutionizing our understanding of the past, revealing connections and complexities invisible to traditional historical methods. The public response shows that people are hungry for more nuanced and evidence-based narratives about human origins, noted Dr. Vaughn. When presented properly, these scientific discoveries don't threaten people's sense of identity. They enrich it by revealing the remarkable journeys that brought our ancestors to where we are today. The Bayerline research also influenced how other scientists communicated about human genetic diversity. It demonstrated that discoveries about population-specific genetic patterns could be presented in ways that emphasized connection and complexity rather than division or hierarchy. Beyond the public impact, the continuing scientific investigation of the Bayerline component revealed new dimensions of this genetic mystery. By expanding their sampling to include more diverse populations across Eurasia, the research team identified related genetic signatures in unexpected places, including among certain Central Asian, Siberian, and Native American populations. These connections pointed to even older population relationships dating back to the initial divergence of ancestral Eurasian populations approximately 40,000 to 45,000 years ago. They suggested that what had been identified as the Bayerline component in Germany represented just one branch of a much larger genetic lineage that had spread across northern Eurasia during the Upper Paleolithic. We're essentially seeing the genetic echoes of one of the earliest expansions of anatomically modern humans across northern latitudes, explained Dr. Mitchell. These people developed specific adaptations to cold environments that persist in modified forms across many northern populations today. This broader perspective transformed understanding of the Bayerline component from a German or European curiosity into evidence of much larger patterns in human evolutionary history. It revealed how ancient adaptations developed in one environment could be carried across continents, persisting through multiple population turnovers and social transformations. As techniques for analyzing ancient DNA continued to advance, the research team was able to extract more detailed information from their samples, including epigenetic markers that revealed information about environmental exposures, diet, and health conditions experienced by ancient individuals. These epigenetic analyses showed that carriers of the bloodline component had experienced significant dietary shifts during the Neolithic transition, suggesting they may have adapted differently to agricultural diets than other European populations. They also showed evidence of exposure to distinctive pathogens, possibly explaining the unique immune-related genetic variants within this component. The epigenetic evidence gives us glimpses of the lived experiences of these ancient people, noted Dr. Mitchell. We can see not just their genetic code, but how that code was modified by their environments and lifestyles. By 2025, nearly 5 years after the initial discovery, the investigation of the bloodline component had expanded into a multidisciplinary research program involving over 200 scientists from 28 countries. What had begun as a puzzling anomaly in a single ancient DNA sample had developed into a new framework for understanding European genetic history, one that emphasized complexity, interconnection, and the dynamic relationship between biology and society. The German DNA mystery had not been so much solved as expanded. Each answer generated new questions, each discovery revealed new complexities, and each insight deepened appreciation for the remarkable journey recorded in human genomes. As Stefan Ihrig reflected on the project's evolution, he noted how it had transformed not just scientific understanding but his own perspective on human history. When we first identified this unusual genetic signature, we thought we'd discovered something uniquely German. What we actually found was evidence of how connected human populations have always been, across time, across continents, and across the artificial boundaries we draw between cultures and nations. The story of the bloodline component, from mammoth hunting migrants to medieval monarchs to modern genetic medicine, demonstrated how a single thread of genetic continuity could connect humans across 40,000 years of tumultuous history. It showed how our bodies carry the legacy of countless ancestors whose journeys, struggles, adaptations, and choices continue to shape us in ways we are only beginning to understand. Most profoundly, it revealed that the true story of human genetic history is neither simple population replacement nor straightforward genetic continuity, but rather a complex tapestry where biological inheritance interacts with social structures, cultural practices, environmental pressures, and historical contingencies to create patterns of remarkable intricacy and beauty. The journey from a puzzling anomaly in an ancient bone fragment to a fundamental reconsideration of European genetic history illustrates the transformative power of modern genomic science. The bloodline discovery has rewritten not just what we know about German ancestry, but how we think about human population history more broadly. Traditional narratives of European origins emphasized major population replacements, hunter-gatherers giving way to farmers, farmers being partially replaced by steppe pastoralists. The bloodline component reveals a more complex reality where certain genetic lineages persist through multiple population turnovers, sometimes hidden at low frequencies, sometimes concentrated in specific social groups, but never entirely disappearing. This persistence challenges our understanding of human adaptation and resilience. It suggests that human groups have maintained biological and cultural continuity through extreme climatic events, technological revolutions, social transformations, and political upheavals. Even when their numbers dwindled to near extinction, certain lineages found ways to survive, adapt, and eventually flourish again under new conditions. The concentration of these ancient genetic markers in medieval German royalty reveals something equally profound about the relationship between biology and social structure. What began as random genetic variation became transformed into markers of status and legitimacy during specific historical periods. Biology influenced society, but society also shaped the distribution and significance of biological traits in ways that created new patterns of genetic distribution. Perhaps most remarkably, the bloodline component demonstrates how the distant past continues to influence the present in tangible ways. Genetic adaptations that evolved in response to Ice Age conditions still affect health outcomes in modern populations. Cultural memories of ancient peoples persist in folklore and tradition even when their original context has been forgotten. Political structures established by medieval rulers carrying these ancient genetic markers shaped institutions that continue to influence modern European societies. This continuity across time does not mean that human populations are static or unchanging. Rather, it reveals that change occurs in complex, multidimensional patterns where some elements transform rapidly while others persist with remarkable stability. Human history is neither a story of complete rupture nor one of unbroken continuity. It is a dynamic process where the ancient and the novel continually interact to create new configurations. As we look to the future, the Byerline discovery offers valuable perspective on contemporary questions about human diversity, migration, and adaptation. It reminds us that human populations have always been in motion, always mixing and transforming, always carrying forward elements of the past, while creating new possibilities for the future. It suggests that our capacity to maintain cultural and biological continuity through dramatic environmental and social changes may be one of humanity's most important adaptive traits. The mystery of German DNA, from mammoth hunters to monarchs to modern Europeans, is ultimately a window into the larger mystery of human resilience and adaptability. It shows how a small band of migrants, facing climate catastrophe in their Central Asian homeland 45,000 years ago, could begin a journey whose genetic and cultural echoes would still be detectable in royal palaces 40,000 years later and in modern medical genetics today. In our genes, as in our cultures and technologies, we carry the accumulated wisdom and adaptations of countless ancestors who faced challenges, made choices, and found ways to survive and flourish in changing environments. Their legacy lives on in each of us, a biological time capsule connecting us to the deepest human past and reminding us that we are all part of a single, remarkable story that spans continents and millennia. In every human genome lies a chronicle more ancient than our oldest texts, more detailed than our most careful archaeological records, and more personal than our most intimate family histories. A living document of resilience, adaptation, and connection that continues to unfold with each new generation.